Welcome to the Bullvine Podcast, your premier source for dairy industry news and insights. Today we're breaking down the top 5 stories that shook the dairy world for the week ending March 29th, 2025. From biosecurity failures to market disruptions and genetic breakthroughs, this week has delivered critical developments every dairy producer needs to understand. Let's dive right in. Our first headline brings troubling news from Minnesota, where we're seeing history repeat itself in the worst possible way. A dairy farm previously hit by H5N1 has been reinfected with the highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, raising serious questions about biosecurity protocols and their implementation. This reinfection at the same location highlights critical gaps in disease prevention strategies. The repeat occurrence suggests that initial remediation efforts were insufficient, potentially putting neighboring operations at continued risk. For dairy producers nationwide, this serves as a stark reminder that one-time responses to biosecurity breaches aren't enough. Continuous vigilance and improved protocols are essential. The Minnesota case should prompt every dairy operation to reassess their own biosecurity measures. Are your farm workers following proper decontamination procedures between barn areas? Have you implemented strict controls on visitor access? Does your operation have an updated emergency response plan ready for immediate activation? These questions aren't academic. They're now fundamental to your business survival.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Bullvine. You are not going to believe this one.
Oh, no.
So we just got some breaking news and we had to talk about it.
Yeah.
We have to dive into this because it's really, really concerning. H5N1 avian influenza has hit a Minnesota dairy farm again.
Oh, wow.
And, we saw this last summer, same farm, Stearns County, Minnesota,
Yep.
600 head herd. And it's like, oh my gosh, and as dairy producers ourselves, this is top of mind for us. What is going on here? Are our current strategies working? Are biosecurity measures actually doing what they're supposed to do? Because this kind of feels like a gut punch,
Absolutely. I think it sends a chill down your spine, right? Because it really makes you wonder what went wrong.
Yeah.
Was it just a random occurrence, or is there a real weakness in our system here? And, looking at some of the reports and expert analysis coming out, it really suggests that maybe this isn't just a simple migratory bird issue.
Yeah.
There could be some real deeper systemic issues within our biosecurity and surveillance protocols that we need to address. And this particular case in Stearns County, Minnesota.
Yeah.
The first one in Minnesota livestock since last summer.
Since last summer on the same farm.
On the same farm. And it really, forces us to confront that maybe those initial efforts weren't enough
Right.
to prevent that reinfection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's why we wanted to dive in, deep into this Stearns County reinfection.
Yeah.
Let's kind of unpack this a little bit. Let's understand why this might have happened. What are the holes in our current surveillance methods?
Yeah.
Are biosecurity measures, really as tight as we think they are? And we have to consider the economics of this.
Absolutely.
This is hitting producers where it hurts, and we're also going to look at what other regions are doing differently, like the EU. See if we can glean some insights, some practical advice, maybe even that you can take back to your operation. Because the point here isn't just to report the news, but to actually help you protect your livelihood.
Yeah, I think what's really concerning about this specific reinfection is that it really points to a potential flaw in our surveillance.
Right.
Because this farm in Stearns County was part of that network. Minnesota has 1,600 dairy herds undergoing routine monthly bulk milk sampling.
Right.
So it's doing its job. Right, the system detected the virus. However, it's the same farm.
It's the same farm
being hit again so soon.
Right.
So that raises a critical question: is finding the virus after it's already present a truly effective long-term strategy?
Yeah, it's like finding out you have mastitis problems after your bulk tank at SCC spikes.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, we identified it, but how do we actually prevent it?
Yeah.
Right. And so I know Michael Crusen from the Minnesota Board of Animal Health, he mentioned, Stearns County's location as, a migratory bird hotspot.
Right.
And that makes sense on the surface, but when you look at, some of the other research out there, particularly USDA's findings, from last year, their reports were pretty clear that movement of shared equipment between farms' flow of personnel, even, having poultry or cats on dairy operations were actually significant contributors to the spread of H5N1. So while wild birds might bring it to the area, it's our practices, it's our movements, that are really contributing to that spread.
Interesting.
And the fact that this is a repeat infection on the same farm makes you think, were the biosecurity measures that they implemented after that first round really enough?
Were they thorough enough?
Yeah.
Did they consider all avenues, all those different ways that this thing can spread?
Exactly. So it really brings us to this question of biosecurity. We've got the protocols in place, we've even invested in them, but is this one of those things where, biosecurity has become more about compliance, checking the boxes, than actually having deeply ingrained, rigorously enforced practices.
So it's not enough to just have a written protocol, right? It needs to be meticulously followed by every single person, every single day.
Every single day.
And, all those pathways, all those vulnerabilities need to be consistently addressed. And, there are programs that offer financial help for biosecurity upgrades and things like that. But they're only part of the solution, right? If that doesn't translate into a fundamental shift in behavior and a real culture of vigilance on the farm, then you're still at a really high risk. And I think that's what we're seeing play out here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for those producers who do find themselves facing an outbreak, like this farm in Stearns County, it triggers the quarantine period. And we're talking at least 30 days of no animal movement, stringent protocols for handling manure waste milk. And while it's essential to contain the virus, the financial hit is huge.
It's significant, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just the immediate loss of milk revenue, right? Think about the logistics of disposing of that unsaleable milk.
Yeah.
Maybe having to invest in specialized equipment like pasteurizers to handle that. Permits for even routine operations become more complicated.
Yeah.
So it's a huge burden when you're already working with tight margins.
Absolutely. And then you add in the, the USDA's ELA program, that emergency assistance program, and it's meant to help offset some of these losses. But there's a 60-day ownership requirement for livestock to be eligible.
Oh, wow.
So if you're a new producer or you've recently expanded your herd, you might not even be eligible for that assistance.
It's a tough situation to be in.
It's a tough one. Yeah. And it really kind of points to the fact that, these support mechanisms, while well-intentioned, may not always align with the realities of how dairy farming works today.
Absolutely. And that 60-day clause, it could be a real roadblock for producers who need that help. And even when ELAP does provide compensation the way they calculate it, it might not capture the full extent of the disruption and the long-term effects on the herd's health and productivity.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of, support and, surveillance and all that, we've talked about this bulk milk testing program being implemented in Minnesota and a few other states. On the one hand, it's great. It gives us an early warning system, but this reinfection on a farm that's actively participating in the program makes you wonder, how effective is it as a preventative measure?
It's a good question. And I think what's important to remember about bulk milk testing is that it's really designed to detect the virus once it's already gained a foothold in the herd. So you're not catching those very first infections. You're letting the virus spread to a certain level before it even shows up in the bulk tank. And then you need further testing to confirm. So there's delays built into the system. And crucially, as the USDA pointed out, this testing doesn't address those human factors.
The human element.
The movement of people and equipment, which seem to be big drivers of transmission.
Huge.
So it's a valuable tool. But it's not the be-all, end-all.
It's not the whole picture.
It's not the whole picture.
Yeah, it's like identifying the smoke, but not necessarily stopping the sparks that started the fire.
Exactly.
And while we're talking about all this, we can't forget the human cost of this. Officials might say, the risk to the general public is low, but for the farmers and the employees who are on those front lines every day, this is their reality.
It's their livelihood,
And we've seen the CDC report 70 confirmed human cases of H5N1 in the U.S., including dairy workers, in Wisconsin and Iowa.
Scary.
So this is a real tangible risk to our community.
And it's not just the infection itself, right? It's the practical challenges of consistently using PPE. Those N95 masks, gloves, eye protection, all that. Sometimes those things are hard to come by.
Absolutely.
And it's not always easy to use them properly for long hours.
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
And then there's the mental and emotional toll. You know, the constant worry, the anxiety, the potential for burnout.
Absolutely.
And then you layer on the economic pressures.
Yeah.
Which can force really difficult decisions.
Yeah.
You know, if processors start refusing milk from farms under quarantine,
right,
then producers are left with having to dispose of it,
right,
which just adds to their losses. And, you know, there was this quote from a farmer in Stearns County that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
They said they feel stuck between birds and bureaucrats.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that just perfectly captures the frustration of being caught in this really difficult situation.
It's a feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you add up all the financial hits,
right.
You know, lost production, costs of quarantine, potential ineligibility for ELAB,
right.
And then the possibility of insurance premiums going up.
Oh, yeah.
If H5N1 becomes a recurring issue,
right.
This could be catastrophic for the dairy industry.
Absolutely. And, you know, research from places like CIJOP is painting a pretty stark picture.
Yeah.
They're estimating a potential 20% reduction in milk production.
Per cow.
Per cow during an outbreak.
Wow.
And that could lead to losses exceeding $737,000 per farm.
Yeah, and we talked about ELAV, you know, as a potential safety net, but even their example of a 500 cow herd, you know, receiving that $900,000 in reimbursement,
right,
it might not cover everything.
It might not be enough.
And that's a scary thought.
Yeah, and this could easily shift from being an isolated incident to a chronic economic vulnerability for the entire industry.
Right.
Which is a huge concern when margins are already so tight.
Absolutely. So it really makes you wonder, are there better approaches out there?
Yeah.
Are other regions doing things differently that we could learn from? And you know, the reports that we've seen point to the EU's strategy as being a lot more comprehensive than what we're doing.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about the EU's approach is that it's very proactive.
Yeah.
And multifaceted.
Okay.
So they're not just reacting to outbreaks, they're trying to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Right.
So they often implement mandatory biosecurity zones.
Oh, wow.
Creating clear separation between different types of livestock operations.
Okay.
Particularly poultry and dairy.
Okay.
They also prioritize wild bird deterrence.
Interesting.
Like netting feed storage areas, eliminating standing water,
right,
things that attract wild birds. And then they use really detailed genetic testing to trace specific strains of the virus.
Okay.
Which helps them differentiate between that initial introduction from wild birds and later spread due to on-farm practices or human interactions.
Right.
So they're really getting to the bottom of how these things are spreading.
So they're not just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. They're really trying to.
They're being very targeted and proactive.
Be strategic. Yeah.
Yeah. And that seems to be a big difference from the more reactive test and respond approach that we've seen here in the U.S.
Yeah. So let's bring this all home for you, the listener.
Okay.
We've looked at this reinfection in Stearns County.
Yeah.
The limitations of our current surveillance.
Right.
Real questions about how biosecurity is being implemented on the ground.
Right.
The economic burdens that this is placing on producers.
Yeah.
The human cost.
Absolutely.
And then what other regions are doing differently.
Right.
So what are some key takeaways that you as a dairy producer need to be thinking about right now?
So first off, it's pretty clear that relying solely on bulk milk testing is not a foolproof prevention strategy. Right. It's a great tool for identification.
But piece of the puzzle.
It's a piece of the puzzle. But this reinfection on a farm that was in that surveillance network really highlights that.
Right.
Secondly, you know, having biosecurity protocols on paper, that's great.
It's a good start.
It's a good start, but the real protection comes from rigorously and consistently implementing them.
By everyone.
By everyone involved in the operation.
Yeah.
And again, this reinfection raises some serious questions about how effective those practices were following the initial outbreak.
Right.
Third, you know, we can't oversimplify things and just blame migratory birds.
Right.
Human factors like the movement of equipment and people between farms play a huge role.
Yeah, the USDA report was very clear on that.
Absolutely. And fourth, while quarantine is necessary, it puts a huge financial strain on producers.
Absolutely.
And programs like ELIP with their eligibility requirements may not be accessible to everyone who needs help.
Right.
And finally, you know, the EU's proactive and multifaceted approach to biosecurity offers some really valuable lessons.
Absolutely.
It suggests that a more preventative and comprehensive strategy might be the way to go.
Yeah, and we can't forget the economic realities here. we're not just talking about managing an outbreak.
Yeah.
This has the potential to be a persistent threat to the dairy industry. And that means, insurance premiums could go up further, squeezing those already thin margins.
Yeah. And those projections from CIDRAP about significant milk losses and the potential costs per farm are really concerning.
They are. And, as we saw with the ELAP example, even those large reimbursement figures might not be enough to cover everything.
Right. It's not the whole picture.
It's not the whole picture. And we have to remember the human side of this, too.
Absolutely.
The risks to workers.
The stress, the challenges of using PPE effectively. And, we can't forget those 70 reported human cases in the U.S.
Yeah, including those dairy workers.
Including dairy workers. It's a real risk.
And that farmer who said they felt stuck between birds and bureaucrats.
Yeah.
It's powerful, and it really highlights the feeling of so many producers out there.
It does.
So as we wrap up this urgent look at this situation, this reinfection in Minnesota, it's a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Hoping for the best isn't a strategy.
Right.
What concrete steps are you going to take starting today to really evaluate and strengthen your biosecurity?
Absolutely.
Go beyond the checklist
and
build real resilience into your operation.
It's time to get proactive.
It is. We need to think long-term about this and advocate for more proactive, effective measures, both on our farms and from our regulatory agencies.
It's a shared responsibility.
It is.
And speaking of H5N1, things are heating up globally. An outbreak in UK sheep has revealed a shocking link to deadly mastitis that could ripple through global dairy herds. This is a wake-up call, folks, and it's one we can't afford to hit snooze on. Here's what you need to know to protect your operation.
We've got some breaking news here out of the UK that's got us pretty concerned, and we wanted to bring it to everyone in the dairy industry right away.
Yeah, this is one you don't want to miss.
It's a big one. And frankly, it's kind of got us on edge here a little bit in the Bullvine newsroom.
I think on edge is a good way to put it.
So we're going to do a deep dive right now and try to unpack exactly what's happening and, more importantly, what it means for you and your operation.
Exactly. We're going to cut through the noise and get right to the actionable stuff so you can protect your dairy.
That's what we're here for. So what we're looking at is the first ever detection of H5N1 in a sheep in the UK. And this sheep was exhibiting mastitis.
Yeah, and that mastitis connection, that's what has everyone on edge.
Right, and we're already dealing with H5N1 in cows, but why is this sheep case so alarming? Why should our listeners be worried about this?
Well, I think what's really got people's attention is that the udder seems to be a primary target for this particular strain of avian influenza. We've seen a lot of data pointing in this direction, especially with the U.S. outbreaks, and now this UK case really solidifies it.
So are you saying it's not just a respiratory virus that happens to show up in milk? It's actually going after the udder itself?
That's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about anecdotal evidence here. There's some pretty compelling research backing this up.
Okay, like what?
Well, for instance, there was a study published in the Journal of Dairy Science back in May 2024.
Okay.
It showed that the H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. Well, that's the one we're dealing with right now, and it seems to have a much stronger affinity for bovine mammary epithelial cells. Meaning it binds more easily to the cells in the udder compared to, say, the cells in the lungs.
Okay, so it's like it has a better key to unlock and infect the udder cells?
Exactly. The study actually found that its binding efficiency to udder cells was 300% higher than to lung tissue.
300% higher. Wow, that's significant.
It is, and I think that really helps explain the huge milk production losses we've seen on some of those U.S. dairy farms hit by H5N1.
Right. I remember reading those USDA outbreak reports and seeing those numbers, 40% to 90% losses in milk production. That's devastating.
Absolutely. And this research helps explain why those drops are so dramatic. It's not just a secondary symptom of the virus. It's the virus directly attacking the milk-producing cells.
It makes that story we covered in Horde's Dairyman about that Texas dairy farmer Hank Grotek even more relevant.
Oh, yeah, Hank's story.
Yeah, he talked about how they initially thought it was just regular mastitis until the authorities got involved. It just goes to show how our whole understanding of mastitis needs to change.
We can't just assume it's a bacterial infection anymore.
Exactly. We got this whole other dimension to consider now.
And that brings up a really critical question for all our listeners out there. Are your biosecurity protocols strong enough to handle a virus that's specifically targeting the udder like this?
It's a good question, and the answer might be a little unsettling based on what we've seen in the U.S.
Right. We've got some hard data from the U.S. outbreaks that really highlight some serious vulnerabilities.
The USDA report from June 2025 was pretty eye-opening.
Oh, yeah, that one was a wake-up call.
The fact that 63% of the infected U.S. farms had poultry on site, that's a huge red flag.
It definitely suggests some pretty big gaps in our biosecurity practices.
But what is it about having poultry and dairy cattle in the same place that's so risky?
Well, it's not just about the birds being nearby. It's about all the potential pathways for transmission that open up when you've got different species sharing the same environment.
So shared feed sources,
Right.
airflow in the barns, even manure management.
Exactly. All those things become potential routes for the virus to spread.
It's not just casual contact. It's the whole farm environment that could be contaminated.
And we're not even talking about those direct biosecurity lapses that the USDA report highlighted.
Oh, right, the deadly mistakes.
Some of them were just mind-boggling, like using the same equipment for both poultry and cattle.
Which is a direct violation of NMPF Code 4.7a, by the way.
Exactly. The NMPF has got some pretty clear standards for a reason. And then you've got people skipping boot dips at the parlor entrances.
Yeah, that always seems like such a small thing, but it can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And then there's this whole idea that freestall equals flu-free, which is just not true.
The virus can still spread through the air and through contact.
Right. It's almost like we've been so focused on bacterial infections that we're not mentally prepared for a highly contagious virus that can jump between species.
And that's where that whole argument about the regulators being behind the curve comes in.
Exactly. The Bullvine's been pretty vocal about that.
We've been pushing for more proactive surveillance, like bulk tank milk PCR testing twice a week.
Using those FDA-approved systems like UtterSafe.
Right, because we need to be ahead of this thing, not just reacting to it.
Early detection is absolutely critical.
So we've got this UK sheep case, the research showing the virus loves udder cells, the biosecurity breakdowns in the US, and the need for better testing. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's a pretty serious situation.
So what does all this mean for our listeners right now? What should they be doing today to protect their farms?
Well, we've talked about a 3-step survival plan, and I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, so step 1 is Mastitis Monitoring 2.0. What does that entail?
It's about taking mastitis monitoring to a whole new level. We're talking daily California mastitis tests during every milking.
So CMTs every day.
Every single day. That's
Yep.
the only way to catch any subtle changes in milk quality that might be an early warning sign.
And on top of that, we're also recommending the regular use of those lactic acid teat dips.
Right. There was a study in the Journal of Dairy Science in April 2024 that showed lactic acid dips can reduce viral load by 78%.
78%. That's pretty impressive.
It is. It's a simple step, but it can make a huge difference.
Okay, so daily CMTs and lactic acid dips. That's step 1. What about step 2, the lockdown protocols?
This one is all about minimizing the risk of cross-species transmission. And we're not mincing words here. The strongest recommendation we can make is a complete ban on all poultry from dairy facilities.
And when we say all, we mean all backyard chickens, everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The risk is just too high. We also strongly advise looking into UVC lighting for your milk parlors.
UVC lighting.
Yeah. There was some research published in Applied Microbiology in 2025 showing that UVC light can neutralize almost all of the H5N1 virus in just 8 seconds.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It is. It's a really effective way to reduce airborne transmission.
So banning all poultry and installing UVC lighting, those are some pretty big changes.
They are, but when you consider the alternative widespread outbreaks, massive milk losses, and potential animal deaths, it's really not that drastic.
It's about protecting your livelihood.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the cows and the milk either. We have to think about the consumer, too.
Right. Consumer confidence is a huge factor here.
The Progressive Dairy poll showed that 1 in 3 consumers are now questioning the safety of milk.
That's a big problem for the industry.
It is. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, and we need to be proactive about maintaining consumer trust.
Absolutely. We need to be radically transparent.
Okay, so what does radical transparency actually look like on a dairy farm?
Oh, for starters, you could live stream your milk testing procedures online. Let consumers see for themselves how seriously you're taking this.
Interesting.
You could also create biosecurity report cards outlining all the protocols you have in place and make those available to your customers.
So they can see exactly what you're doing to keep their milk safe.
Exactly. And you could even put QR codes on your milk cartons that link to USDA safety data and information about your farm's biosecurity practices.
So consumers can scan the code and get all the details.
Right. It's about being open and proactive.
Those are some really good ideas. And while we're talking about being proactive, We need to address the financial side of things, too.
That's right. The financial stakes are incredibly high here.
I remember that warning from Dr. Lorna Bendixson, the Wisconsin vet.
Oh yeah, Dr. Bendixson doesn't sugarcoat things.
She said that if an infected ewe goes undetected, a dairy farm could lose over $200,000 before breakfast.
And she's not exaggerating. The losses from milk production animal deaths and the cost of implementing all these biosecurity measures can add up fast.
It's a scary thought.
It is. But it also underscores why early detection and strong biosecurity are so critical.
So before we wrap up, can you just give our listeners the key takeaways from our deep dive today?
Sure. The main point is that this H5N1 situation is very serious. The connection to mastitis means we need to completely rethink how we monitor udder health.
Daily CMTs, lactic acid teat dips.
Right. And biosecurity has to be top priority. We need to eliminate contact between poultry and dairy cattle and seriously consider investing in technologies like UVC lighting.
And we can't forget about the consumer.
Transparency is key. We need to be open about our practices and show consumers that we're doing everything we can to keep their milk safe.
Dr. Bendixson called this DEFCON 1 for dairy.
And I think she's right. This is not the time to be complacent.
We need to act now.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for everyone listening. Think about how all of this might change the future of dairy farming.
How will this outbreak and this virus shape our industry going forward?
What will consumers expect from us in terms of safety and transparency?
These are big questions, and we all need to be thinking about the answers.
This isn't just about getting through the current outbreak. This could fundamentally change the dairy landscape forever.
It's a lot to process. But we hope this deep dive has given our listeners the information they need to navigate these challenging times.
Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe.
And as always, thanks for joining us here at the Bullvine. We'll keep you updated as this story develops.
We'll be right here with you every step of the way.
Let's shift gears to some groundbreaking news. The genetic revolution sweeping through U.S. dairies is shattering records for milk components like butterfat and protein. Genomics are redefining what's possible for milk production. But the real question is, are your herds ready for the future? Let's unpack the details.
Okay, folks, gather around because today we're going to talk about milk. And not just any milk, the kind of milk that's going to make you rethink everything you thought you knew.
That's right. We're talking about the milk you're getting from your cows today. And let me tell you, it's genetically different and way more valuable than the milk your grandpa was producing back in the day.
We're talking about a genetic revolution that's changing the very makeup of milk. So get ready to dive deep into this fascinating world of dairy genetics.
You hit the nail on the head. We're seeing this incredible surge in butterfat and protein levels in the U.S. milk supply. And it's happening while overall milk production is pretty much flat.
Yeah, it's like we've hit a ceiling on milk volume, but the quality dial is cranked way up, and you know what that means, right?
It means more cheese, more butter, more of all the good stuff that makes the dairy industry tick, and it couldn't be happening at a better time with all this new processing capacity coming online.
Exactly $8 billion worth of new plants by 2027, all geared toward churning out those high-value dairy products. So if you're a dairy farmer listening in, you're probably wondering what's driving this component surge.
And more importantly, what does it mean for your operation, and how can you position your herd to really cash in on this genetic gold rush?
That's exactly what we're here to break down today. The forces behind this component surge, the impact it's having on the industry, and what you as a dairy producer need to know to stay ahead of the curve.
Think of this as your roadmap to navigating the ever-evolving world of dairy genetics. Buckle up, because we're about to embark on a deep dive into the numbers, the science, and the economics of this milk component revolution.
All right, let's jump right into it and talk about this unprecedented component surge that everyone's buzzing about.
Well, first, let's look at the data, because numbers don't lie. We've seen butterfat set new annual records for 4 years running, now breaking through that 4% ceiling in 2021.
4%. You know, that's a level we haven't seen since right after World War II. It's like we're rewriting the history books with each new lactation cycle.
And by 2024, the national average for butterfat climbed even higher, hitting an impressive 4.23%. It's truly remarkable.
It really is. And on the protein side, we're seeing similar gains, which is music to the ears of cheesemakers everywhere. Protein has been setting yearly records from 2016 all the way through 2024.
In fact, the average protein content in 2024 hit 3.29%, significant jump from the 3.04% we saw back in 2004.
So we're seeing this remarkable increase in components, but the interesting thing is that it's not tied to an increase in milk volume, right?
Exactly. It's like the recipe for milk itself is changing. If we look at the period from 2011 to 2024, the growth rates tell the story. Milk volume increased by a decent 15.9%.
Okay, not bad. But then you look at protein production, which jumped by 23.6%, and butterfat, well, that took off like a rocket with a 30.2% increase.
It's clear that the focus is shifting from simply producing more milk to producing more valuable milk that's packed with those components that the market's demanding.
It's like for years, the mantra was more milk, more milk, more milk, but now the game has changed. The genetics are pushing us in a different direction, one that could be far more lucrative for dairy producers.
And this component surge is happening against a backdrop of stagnant milk production. Overall, we've seen back-to-back years of slight decline in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah, and even the growth in 2022 was pretty minimal. So it's clear that the future of dairy isn't about squeezing out every last drop. It's about maximizing the value of every drop. And that's where genetics comes in.
Absolutely. Genetics is the key driver behind this component revolution. And the advancements we've seen in genomics over the past decade have been nothing short of game-changing.
You know, I remember when genomic testing first came on the scene, it was like this futuristic technology that nobody really understood, but now it's become an indispensable tool for dairy producers across the globe.
It really has. By analyzing an animal's DNA and comparing it to a massive database, we can now predict with remarkable accuracy, about 70% to be precise, the genetic potential of a young calf, even before she's had her first calf.
It's like having a crystal ball for your breeding program. You can identify those genetically superior animals early on and make informed decisions about which ones to invest in.
And the amount of data we've collected on dairy cattle is staggering.
Right.
It's made the dairy cow one of the most intensely studied domestic animals on the planet, as Dr. John Cole from USDA AGIL pointed out.
He's right. We have this incredible wealth of phenotypic data, which is the stuff we can actually measure, like milk yield component percentages and health traits. And it's this phenotypic data that really allows us to fine-tune the accuracy of our genomic predictions.
It's like having the recipe book and then detailed notes on how every batch turned out. Combining the genetic code with real-world performance data gives us a powerful tool for driving genetic progress.
And speaking of progress, the adoption rate for genomic testing has been absolutely phenomenal, hasn't it?
It's been exponential. It took 7 years after the technology emerged in 2009 to hit 1 million genotype dairy animals, but then things really took off.
Yeah, we hit 5 million tests by March of 2021, and then just a few short years later, in December 2024, we blew past the 10 million mark.
And this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon either. A third of those tests have been conducted in 72 other countries around the world, so it's a truly global revolution.
It really highlights the impact this technology is having on the dairy industry worldwide. And it's not just about having access to this genetic information. It's about how it's fundamentally changing the way we think about improving productivity on our farms.
You're absolutely right. If we go back a few decades, say, to the period between the late 1950s and the 1980s, most of the gains in milk production were driven by management practices, things like better nutrition, improved housing, and herd health protocols.
Back then, it was all about optimizing the environment and providing the best possible care for the animals.
Then from the 1980s to around the year 2000, we saw a more balanced contribution from both genetics and management. That's when sire selection based on pedigree and production records really started to gain traction.
It was a time of transition as producers began to understand the power of selective breeding.
But then around the turn of the millennium, something really interesting happened. Genetics started to overtake management as the primary driver of productivity gains.
Yeah, by 2015, genetics was estimated to be contributing over 60% to the increase in milk production, and by 2022, that figure had climbed to over 70%. It's like the DNA of our cows became the engine of progress.
And that brings us to a major event that every dairy producer needs to be aware of, the April 2025 genetic reset. It's a major recalibration of the entire dairy cattle breeding landscape.
April 1st, 2025, mark it on your calendars, folks, because the CDCB is rolling out some big changes. We're talking simultaneous updates to the lifetime merit indices and a shift to a new base population of cows born in 2020.
It's the first time we've seen a combined update of this magnitude since 2015, and it's all about keeping our genetic compass pointed in the right direction.
So it's like hitting the reset button on the entire genetic evaluation system.
In essence, yes, the CDCB typically adjusts these evaluations every 5 years or so to keep pace with the industry's advancements. And the 2025 shift is a reflection of the incredible genetic progress we've made over the past decade.
And this means that all animals will now have their genetic merit assessed relative to a new benchmark, the average genetic merit of cows born in 2020 instead of 2015.
Exactly. And this new base population is going to lead to some adjustments in the predicted transmitting abilities, or PTAs, for various traits.
So what kind of adjustments can we expect to see?
Well, for Holsteins, we're projecting a downward adjustment around 750 pounds for milk. PTA 45 pounds for fat, and 30 pounds for protein.
Wow. Those are some significant adjustments.
They are, but it's important to remember that it's not a reflection of any decline in the actual genetic potential of the animals. It's simply a new frame of reference, a recalibration of the system.
It's like Dr. Cole pointed out, it's like resetting the odometer on your car. The numbers go down, but the capability of the vehicle hasn't changed.
Precisely. And to really grasp the speed of genetic improvement, it's helpful to compare the scale of these base changes over time. In 2025, the Holstein base for butterfat is rolling back by 51 pounds, and for protein by 36 pounds.
Those are some big numbers.
They are, especially when you compare them to the 2015 reset, where the rollback was just 17 pounds for fat and 12 pounds for protein.
Yeah.
That dramatic acceleration really highlights how rapidly our dairy genetics are evolving.
So a bull that might have looked like a superstar with a sky-high PTA last month might appear a little less dazzling under the new system in April.
That's true, but it's not just the base change that's shaking things up. The merit indices themselves are getting a major makeover as well.
Okay, let's dive into this NM dollar shakeup. What are the big changes that producers need to wrap their heads around?
Well, one of the most significant shifts is the increased emphasis on butterfat. Its weighting in the NM dollar formula is going up by about 13%, reflecting the strong market demand for butterfat, driven in large part by the booming cheese industry.
Cheese, yeah, it seems like everyone's going crazy for cheese these days, and fat is a key ingredient in both yield and flavor, so it makes sense that butterfat is getting more attention.
Absolutely. And with fat prices often hovering around $3.20 per pound, the economic signals are clear fat pace.
That's for sure. And what else has seen a shift in the NM dollar calculations?
Feed efficiency is another area that's getting a much bigger slice of the pie. The combined impact of traits related to how efficiently cows convert feed into milk components is going up by a whopping 41%.
With feed costs being what they are, that makes a lot of sense. Any genetic edge we can get on feed efficiency is a win for dairy producers.
You bet. With feed costs often around $300 per ton, anything we can do to help cows make better use of their feed is going to have a big impact on the bottom line.
It's all about turning feed dollars into milk component dollars as efficiently as possible. And what about other economically important traits? Have those seen any changes in the NM dollar formula?
Well, livability is another one that's getting a lot more attention, with its weighting increasing by a full 100%. This reflects the rising value of cull cows, which are now often bringing in upwards of $1,800 per head.
So keeping cows in the herd longer and reducing involuntary culling is becoming even more important from an economic standpoint.
Precisely, a longer living, healthier cow is simply more profitable.
So it seems like the recipe for the ideal cow, according to the new NM dollar, is one that lives longer, stays healthier, eats less per unit of production, and pumps out milk loaded with butterfat.
You got it in a nutshell. And I think a quote from CDCB Chair Amy Hazel really sums it up nicely. You said, "We're essentially giving fertility traits a 20% promotion and putting milk volume on performance improvement plans."
That pretty much says that all the industry's priorities are shifting towards components efficiency and longevity.
And these shifting priorities are reflected in the updated lifetime merit indices. The weight for fat in NM dollar has gone up, while the weight for protein has actually gone down from 19.6 to 13.
So the message is clear in the new NM dollar efficiency, and components, especially butterfat, are king.
That's right. And it's fascinating to see how these broad genetic trends are playing out differently across the diverse dairy regions of the U.S.
Yeah, we've got different climates, different regulations, different market conditions, all of which can influence our breeding strategies.
Dairy economists have observed some interesting patterns in how traditional dairy states, primarily in the Midwest and Northeast, and modern dairy states, mostly in the West, have approached production improvement over the years.
So we're talking about different herd sizes, different growth patterns, different philosophies almost.
In a way, yes. Traditional states have historically focused on boosting milk yield per cow through meticulous genetic selection and refined management practices.
While modern dairy states have focused on both yield and cow numbers, they've scaled up their operations significantly in recent decades.
And the difference in average herd size between the two regions is pretty striking in the West. You'll see herds with well over 1,000 cows, while in the traditional states, herds tend to be much smaller.
But here's the interesting part. Despite these differences in scale and approach, the productivity gap between the two regions has been steadily shrinking.
Back in the year 2000, modern dairy states had a significant advantage in average milk yield per cow. But by 2022, that gap had narrowed to less than 100 pounds of milk per cow annually.
So they're catching up. It seems like the playing field is leveling out in terms of per cow production.
And the timing of this convergence suggests that the widespread adoption of genomic testing has played a key role, especially in the traditional dairy states.
So faced with limitations on expanding their land base and cow numbers, they've turned to genetics as their primary pathway to growth.
Exactly. They've invested heavily in selecting for higher producing, more efficient animals, and they've complemented those genetic gains with advances in milking technology and management practices.
It's almost like the modern dairy states, having already focused on achieving economies of scale, might now start to place a greater emphasis on maximizing yield per cow through genetics as well.
It's definitely a trend to watch, and it aligns with a broader shift we're seeing across agriculture in general, where gains in overall output are increasingly driven by improvements in efficiency and productivity rather than simply expanding land use or animal numbers.
So while different regions may have slightly different priorities, they're all leveraging the same powerful genetic tools to achieve their goals.
And this industry-wide focus on higher milk components is having ripple effects throughout the entire dairy supply chain.
Yeah, with over 80% of U.S. milk now going into manufactured dairy products like cheese butter and yogurt, higher component levels translate to more valuable raw material for processors and better returns for producers.
Exactly, and the U.S. milk pricing system, with its premiums for higher component levels, provides a strong financial incentive for producers to select for these traits.
You're literally getting paid more for milk that's richer in butterfat and protein, so it's a win-win for everyone involved.
And these market signals have spurred innovation in breeding technologies that go beyond traditional genomics. We've seen a surge in the use of gender-sorted semen, for instance.
Yeah, by 2024, gender-sorted semen accounted for 61% of all dairy semen sold in the U.S. That's a huge increase.
It allows producers to accelerate genetic progress in their replacement heifer pool by using sexed semen on their top cows and then using beef semen on the rest to produce high-value beef cross calves.
It's a smart strategy that optimizes both genetic gain and revenue. And it's not just sexed semen that's gaining traction. We're also seeing increasing use of embryo technology.
Absolutely. Both conventional and in vitro fertilized embryos are being used to amplify the impact of superior genetics, allowing producers to get more offspring from their elite cows.
So it all ties back to that massive investment in new processing capacity we talked about earlier. The market is demanding more high-component milk, and the genetics are helping us deliver.
And the pace of innovation isn't slowing down. The 2025 genetic reset is actually setting the stage for even more advanced selection tools in the years ahead.
Oh, that's exciting. Can you give us a sneak peek at what's on the horizon?
Well, one area that's generating a lot of buzz is the development of rumen microbiome, PTAs. These will link the specific populations of microbes in a cow's rumen to her feed efficiency.
So we're talking about selecting for the tiny organisms that live inside the cow's gut to improve her ability to convert feed into milk.
Exactly. It's taking genetic selection to a whole new level, and we're also expecting to see methane emission indexes emerge as environmental regulations around greenhouse gases become more stringent.
These tools will allow producers to select for cows that produce less methane, helping to reduce the environmental footprint of dairy farming.
And heat tolerance updates will become increasingly important as well. With more and more regions facing heat stress, selecting for cows that can handle the heat will be crucial for maintaining production and animal welfare.
It sounds like we're on the cusp of a new era in dairy genetics with even more precise and powerful tools at our disposal. So how should dairy producers be thinking about positioning their herds to thrive in this rapidly evolving landscape?
Well, as dairy economist Chris Wolf put it, the upcoming April genetic overhaul is both a progress report and a crystal ball. It shows us how far we've come and gives us a glimpse into the future of dairy genetics.
So the cows we'll be milking in 2035 are being designed today through the evaluations and breeding decisions we make.
Exactly. So it's crucial for producers to stay informed and adapt their strategies accordingly.
What are some concrete steps that producers should be considering right now to ensure their herds are future ready?
First, it's essential to recalibrate your sire selection thresholds. Remember that a bull with a plus 2,000 NM dollar under the old system will likely have a lower NM dollar after the reset, so adjust your benchmarks accordingly.
Don't panic when you see those numbers change.
Exactly, and pay close attention to component ratios. The increasing value of butterfat relative to protein means you should prioritize fat in your selection decisions.
And of course, feed efficiency is always important, especially with high feed costs. Selecting for animals that can convert feed efficiently will have a big impact on your bottom line.
And don't neglect fertility and overall health traits, while components and feed efficiency are taking center stage in the revised NM dollar. These are still critically important for profitability and longevity.
It really makes you wonder, how high can these butterfat and protein percentages go? Is there a limit?
That's a great question, and frankly, I don't think we know the answer yet. I believe we're still just scratching the surface of the genetic potential within our dairy cattle.
So we can expect to see even further gains in milk components in the years to come as we continue to refine our breeding programs and selection tools.
Absolutely, and these genetic advancements aren't just abstract numbers. They're having a real impact on the entire dairy industry.
We're seeing a transformation in both dairy production and processing. The continuous improvements in butterfat and protein are ensuring that we can meet the growing demand for high-quality dairy products.
And it's inspiring to see how producers of all sizes are embracing these new technologies and incorporating them into their operations.
The U.S. dairy sector is truly a global leader in genetic improvement, and it's clear that this genetic revolution is far from over.
In fact, I think we're just getting started. The future of dairy is bright, and it's driven by genetics.
So to wrap up today's deep dive, let's recap the key takeaways. We've seen this remarkable rise in milk components driven by the power of genomics.
We've talked about the significance of the upcoming 2025 genetic reset and the shift in economic priorities reflected in the updated NM dollar index.
And we've highlighted the importance of focusing on both components and feed efficiency as key drivers of future profitability and sustainability.
So as you head back to your farms, we encourage you to think about the specific adjustments you'll be making to your breeding strategies to ensure your herds are future ready.
Take a close look at your herd data, familiarize yourself with the new genetic evaluations coming out in April, and consider how these changes will impact your breeding decisions.
The future of dairy is in your hands, and with the right tools and knowledge, you can position your herds for success in this exciting component-driven era.
Thanks for joining us today, folks. Until next time, happy milking.
Finally, we're turning our focus to global trade. U.S. exports of skim milk powder to China have hit a historic low, 0 to be exact. This marks a major structural shift in trade dynamics and puts the dairy industry in a tough spot. Can American producers reclaim their footing, or is this a sign of bigger changes ahead? Let's get into it.
Global trade, you hear about it constantly, but sometimes, honestly, a single number, it really makes you stop and think.
Right.
Like this one, U.S. skim milk powder exports to China.
Yeah.
0, nada, nothing last February. It's a massive shift, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Definitely.
What caused this huge collapse? What does it mean for us, the U.S. dairy industry?
Well, and what I find really interesting is not just the fact that it happened,
right,
but how fast it happened and just how completely that market seems to have vanished.
Yeah.
For U.S. suppliers.
Poof, gone. Not even a little dip, just gone.
Right.
So we've got this report here, fresh from the bullvine. It lays it all out. We're going to unpack why this happened, right? Pricing pressures. China's, honestly, amazing growth in their own dairy production, and how these other big players, New Zealand, the EU, they've kind of positioned themselves.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's a complex situation, tied into, bigger economic trends like deflation in China, potential oversupply here in the U.S.
Yeah, a lot to cover.
So our mission today is to really get to the heart of this change.
And it is crucial, absolutely crucial for anyone involved in dairy or even just following it to understand what this means.
For sure.
Because this isn't just some isolated trade thing. It reflects these much deeper changes happening in the global market.
It's like tectonic plates shifting.
Exactly.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it.
That 0 number, right? U.S. SMP exports to China in February 2025. That jumps off the page.
Yeah.
It's the first time we've seen a complete stop since May 2019.
Wow.
And it's the lowest level since, get this, 2013.
That's a while ago.
So break it down for us. What are the main forces at play here?
So this Bullvine report, they pinpoint two main things. First, there's a big price difference between U.S. SMP and what the EU and New Zealand are offering. By late 2024, U.S. SMP was going for $27 more per metric ton. That's, when you're talking bulk orders, that's a lot of money.
Right.
And this price gap, it probably has to do with the fact that U.S. SMP production dropped by 14% in 2024. Less supply, higher prices.
The less supply here pushed prices up. Makes sense. But that second thing you mentioned, China's own dairy sector, that seems like a huge part of this story.
Oh, it absolutely is. China has been amazing at boosting their own milk production. They set this goal back in 2018 to be self-sufficient, and by 2023, they'd already hit 85% self-sufficiency.
Wow.
Which is like way ahead of schedule. They had this massive increase in domestic raw milk production. I'm talking a jump of about 10 million metric tons from 2018 to 2023. So they just don't need to import as much anymore.
10 million metric tons. That's mind-boggling. I mean, you can see how it would just completely change their needs. So while we were dealing with less production and higher prices, they were basically becoming their own supplier.
Exactly.
Like impressive and also kind of spanky for us.
Right.
So who's filling that gap then? It's the one the U.S. used to have.
Well, New Zealand and the European Union, they've really stepped in. You look at the market share, New Zealand, they control like 68% of China's S&P imports now. 2024 numbers.
Wow.
U.S. share. Well, we already talked about that. And it's not just S&P. New Zealand, they've got 90% of China's whole milk powder market. Dude,
90%.
90%. We sent 0 WMP to China in February.
So they basically got a monopoly. What's their secret?
Well, a big one is their tariff-free trade deal with China. That gives them a massive advantage on price, competitiveness, everything. The EU, they're doing well with S&P, but they also benefit from, their political relationship with China. The U.S., we don't really have that same leverage. The Bullvine report, they put it pretty bluntly.
How so?
They said the U.S. has been priced out of the Chinese market.
Ouch. So it's not just about who's got the cheapest product at any given time. It's about trade deals, relationships, the whole picture.
Right.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of, deflation in China.
Exactly. Their economy is in a deflationary period. Their consumer price index fell by 0.7% in February 2025,
Wow.
which is the biggest drop since 2020. So stuff in China is getting cheaper. And when that happens, expensive imports like our S&P, they're even less appealing.
Makes sense. If everything else is cheaper, why buy the pricey import? Are we seeing this affect other dairy imports too?
Kind of. UHT milk imports dipped in January 2025, but then they leveled off in February. And the Bullvine, they suggest this might be because China is really pushing for self-reliance. They just need less imported UHT milk regardless of price.
It's like a double whammy. Cheaper local options, and they want to rely less on imports in general.
Yeah.
So what about the global milk supply? Could that mess things up even more for us?
Well, Rabobank, they're predicting global milk supply will grow by about 0.8% in 2025.
Okay.
It's not a huge jump, but the problem is we don't know what China's import demand will be. If it doesn't pick up, that extra supply could push global prices down even further. And that's, especially worrying when you consider we might have too much cheese here in the U.S.
Yeah, the report mentioned that, the risk of overproduction.
Right. We've got all this new cheese processing capacity coming online, something like 200 million pounds per year. They probably plan that expansion expecting global demand to keep growing. But if those export markets, especially China, don't come through, we could end up with way too much cheese, and that means prices could crash.
So it's like the perfect storm. We're locked out of a major market, we might have a cheese glut at home, and prices are under pressure globally. Now, the report does say Mexico has become a really important market for U.S. dairy.
Oh, absolutely.
But is that enough to counter all of this?
Mexico's a great market, don't get me wrong, but putting all your eggs in one basket, it's always risky. You need to diversify.
Yeah.
The Bullvine report, they actually point to some critical errors that got us here.
Like what?
Well, one is that we haven't made much progress on these retaliatory tariffs China put on U.S. goods.
Right.
Like, there's this 10% tariff on U.S. pork that's been in place since March 2025. These trade tensions, they just create friction, and it hurts the dairy sector, too.
Yeah.
And another misstep, maybe, was not realizing how changes in other markets, like the EU having butterfat shortages, which help New Zealand, how that could indirectly impact the SMP and WMP markets.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So, given all this, what does the Bullvine recommend? How can U.S. exporters adjust?
They have some really good recommended shifts. One is we need to be more strategic. They suggest U.S. producers should focus more on butter and cheddar cheese, less on SMP.
Okay.
China might not be buying as much SMP and WMP, but there's still some demand for cheese. This would align our production with what the market actually wants, and it's what the EU and New Zealand are already doing.
So go where the demand is. And there are other big recommendations about trade policy, right?
Yeah, they say we need to really push for tariff parity with New Zealand in our trade talks with China. That tariff-free access they have, it's such a huge advantage. We need to level the playing field. If we can get tariff relief, that would directly address that price gap and make our dairy products more attractive to Chinese buyers if and when that market comes back.
But the thing is, and the Bullvine, they're pretty blunt about this in their provocative takeaways for dairy farmers. The Chinese SMP market, it might just be closed for a while. They have so much surplus, and they're really focused on being self-sufficient with the WMAP. they don't see our S&P exports recovering before 2026.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And that warning about potential cheese plant closures here if exports don't improve, that's serious. They recommend farmers use tools like dairy revenue protection, DRP, to hedge their risk.
It's good advice.
And they also say we can't just rely on Mexico. We need to diversify. Look at places like Southeast Asia, where there was some S&P demand growth.
Exactly. We need to think long term.
So what's the call to action? What does the Bullvine say the U.S. dairy industry needs to do?
They lay out three main things. First, we need better price transparency. We need to know what's going on in the market. They say we should be publishing weekly S&P benchmarks.
Okay.
Second, we need to innovate, create new products like high-protein S&P blends specifically designed for what the Chinese market needs, like their bakery sector.
Find those niche opportunities.
Exactly. And lastly, they really emphasize advocacy. We need to put pressure on policymakers in Washington to fight for tariff relief in those trade talks with China.
Yeah, make our voices heard.
Yeah.
So this really shows just how interconnected the global dairy market is.
Yeah.
How quickly things can change.
It absolutely does. And the key takeaway here, the big one, is that the U.S. dairy industry has got some serious challenges in China right now. It's not just one thing. It's the pricing, it's China's self-sufficiency, it's how strong our competitors are.
And that brings us to the Bullvine's final warning. It's a bit ominous, but they say New Zealand and the EU, they're basically reshaping the rules of the game in global dairy trade. And the question for everyone listening, for the whole U.S. dairy sector, is can we adapt fast enough to these changes? Can we keep up, or are we going to get left behind? The Bullvine, they put it pretty starkly. They say we could become collateral damage.
That's a sobering thought. It shows just how high the stakes are. So as you process all this information, think about what it means for the future of U.S. dairy exports. What are the big decisions we need to make now to stay competitive in a global market that is clearly transforming? These are the big questions the situation forces us to confront.
And those are the questions we'll be grappling with in the weeks and months to come.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And be sure to check out the Bullvine for the full report and more in-depth analysis. Till next time, thanks for listening.
See you later.
And that's a wrap for this week's top stories in the dairy world. From biosecurity wake-up calls to groundbreaking genetic advances and shifting trade dynamics, it's clear that every day brings new challenges and opportunities for this industry we all love. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected with the Bullvine for more timely insights. Until next time, keep those herds healthy, those milk checks flowing, and that optimism alive. Catch you later.